BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Humanly Possible by Sarah Bakewell. Read by Emma Fielding. Episode 1. What is humanism? You might get different answers from different kinds of humanists. And there are many of these. Many today define themselves by their choice to live not by religious beliefs, but by principles of empathy, reason, and moral responsibility to other living creatures. They're with Kurt Vonnegut, who said, "I am a humanist, which means that I have tried to behave decently, without any expectation of rewards or punishments after I'm dead." Others are humanists in a more general philosophical sense, putting the individual well-being of people first, whether or not this is combined with a belief in an afterlife or in God. Others still are called humanists because they specialise in the humanities. They teach and study the human studies, as they were originally known: history, the arts, literature. All these varieties of humanists do share something essential. They put the human at the centre of what they do. It is right there in the word. Beyond that, there is no one approved way to be a humanist, and they have no agreed banner to wave. For me, this is part of the appeal. If they did wave a banner, however, there are 3 words they could all agree should appear on it. These are free thinking, inquiry, and hope. Free thinking, because humanists prefer to guide their lives by their own moral conscience, or by evidence, or by responsibilities to others, rather than by dogma or authority. Enquiry, because humanists believe in study and education, and try to practice critical reasoning, which they apply to sacred texts or to any other sources set up as being beyond question. And hope, because humanists feel that, our obvious failings notwithstanding, it is humanly possible for us to achieve worthwhile things during our brief existence on Earth. In recent times, it can be hard to believe in these ideas. We see the rise of repressive regimes and conformist ideologies. We may feel despair over our human and planetary future. I'm convinced, however, that this should not lead us to give up on free thinking, inquiry, or hope. On the contrary, I think we need them more than ever. And now, in case we think we have it bad now, let us start the story in a place and time that was, for many people, vastly worse. The 14th century, on and around the Italian peninsula. If you had a choice, you probably would not want to be born there and then. Life was insecure, with regular hostilities between cities and political groupings. Rome, the historic centre of Christendom, was abandoned by a beleaguered pope, Clement V, who fled his enemies and transferred the court to Avignon. Yet somehow this anguished part of the world produced a surge of literary energy. Through the 1300s, new generations of writers appeared, filled with the spirit of recovery and revival. They hoped to reach back, past the current troubles, past the foundation of Christianity itself, to link hands with the writers of the Roman world, whose works had fallen into varying degrees of forgottenness. These new writers looked to an old model of good living, based on friendship, wisdom, virtue, and the cultivation of power and eloquence in language. Their weapon in all of this was the Studia Humanitatis, the human studies. Signs of a revived interest in the human studies had already appeared in the cosmic visionary Dante Alighieri, but the real beginning came in the generation after his, with 2 writers who, like him, came from Tuscany. Francesco Petrarca, known as Petrarch in English, and Giovanni Boccaccio. They more or less invented the way of life that would be, for the next 2 centuries, the humanist one. Not that they used this label of themselves. The older of the two was Petrarch. He was born in 1304 in Arezzo. His birthplace would have been Florence, but his parents had to flee factional fighting there, never to return. Thus, his early years were lived in alternating phases of flight and temporary refuge before the family made it to Avignon, where his father found work in the papal court, and Petrarch grew into a teenager and young man, sometimes enjoying Avignon's nightlife. Petrarch's father was a notary by profession, and this made it natural for his son to train for a career in a similar law-related field. But Petrarch hated his legal education. While supposedly studying, he put his energy into collecting books instead. When he was 22, his father died, which freed him. He gave up law and started a totally different way of life, the literary one. He began a pattern that he would follow for all his career, working in the entourages of a series of powerful patrons. His jobs involved diplomatic services and secretarial labour, but the main task was doing what Petrarch loved anyway, reading and writing. And boy, did he write. He poured out treatises, dialogues and personal narratives, mini-biographies and triumphal celebrations, and Latin poems and consolatory reflections and blistering invectives. To please himself, as well as others, he wrote beautiful love poetry. Many of these verses were in honour of an idealised woman whom he called Laura. Interestingly, her name evokes the laurel wreaths awarded to poets in the ancient world. The custom had recently been revived, and Petrarch was awarded his laurels at a ceremony in Rome in 1341. Flattered, delighted, and pleased with himself, he was intensely aware of the significance of the classical precedent. He always claimed to despise his own fame, and to be exhausted by the many admirers who came to his door, but it is clear that he loved it, really. When not thinking of the past, he wove his life and writings deeply into the lives of his contemporaries. He developed a vast circle of interesting friends, educated men of a literary bent themselves. This circle also became Petrarch's useful network of fellow bookfinders. Each time his friends went anywhere, he gave them shopping lists of desirable books. Manuscripts, laboriously copied or precariously lent, made their way around the Italian peninsula on dangerous roads filled with robbers. Petrarch himself was often on the move, for his work duties as well as social calls, and wherever he went, he would halt if he saw a monastery in the distance. Who knows if there is something I want here? He would go in and ask to rummage. If he found a text of value, he sometimes stayed for days or weeks to make his own copy of it. Imagine what that was like, having to copy by hand every word of every book you add to your collection. And he often did more than mechanical copying. He pioneered the art of sensitive editing, using fresh manuscript finds to build up fuller versions of ancient texts that had previously existed only in fragments. This was exactly what generations of humanists would continue to love doing, enlarging knowledge, using the evidence to make texts richer and more accurate. It was Petrarch who led the way. Of all the friends with whom Petrarch engaged in book talk in his letters, the one who shines out of the crowd is a fellow Tuscan, Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio showed boundless interest in all the right things: the passion for language, the joy in writing, the dedication to finding and reviving ancient literature, all the elements that made up the humanities scholar of the very early modern world. Both men were intent upon the reviving of the long-ago human studies, which they hope to see reborn from the deep and give a new life for the future. The path to that future was not easy. Starting in 1347, a few years before the two men met, the bubonic plague devastated Europe. 2/3 of the population of Florence died. Petrarch was working in Parma when the plague began. He did not catch it, but friends did, and he lost many, including his Laura back in Avignon. He continued writing love poems, but they became darker and more melancholy. As always, Petrarch's way of getting himself through crises was with literature. Through the 1350s, he worked on a book called Remedies for Fortune, Fair and Foul. It takes the form of two contrasting conversations in which the personified figure of reason responds in turn to those of sorrow and of joy, cheering one with happier thoughts and dampening the other with reminders not to get carried away. Both conversations are designed to protect against relying on good fortune to get us through life. It will always let us down, says reason. A better strategy is to turn to the comforts of study, reflection, and friendship, all of which are mutually enhancing. Petrarch and Boccaccio set themselves to retrieve what they could of the past and to rework it, reimagine it, use it to counter grief, and to pass it on to future generations in the hope that they too would be inspired by it to seek a rebirth. Back in 1341, when Petrarch was submitting his poem Africa as part of the process for being awarded the poet's laurel, he addressed his own work as if it were a child going into that future world. My fate is to live amid varied and confusing storms. But for you, perhaps, if, as I hope and wish, you will live long after me, there will follow a better age. This sleep of forgetfulness will not last forever. When the darkness has been dispersed, our descendants can come again in the former pure radiance. Such talk of darkness and radiance would continue throughout the next century. It formed a new way of visualising European history. Behind him and still around him, Petrarch feels that darkness as a devouring void into which books and humanity alike have fallen. In a long ago time, he believes, the ancients lit up their world with their eloquence and wisdom. In some new period of time to come, future generations may illuminate their world afresh. The hope is to bridge this gap by preserving what can be found or copied, by creating new variations on the old forms, and by keeping it all in precarious existence long enough for the lamps to be relit.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Humanly Possible by Sarah Bakewell, read by Emma Fielding, Episode 2. The humanist tradition in Europe, revived by 14th century writers such as Petrarch and Boccaccio, went on to flourish in Italy above all. It also filtered north across the Alps, bringing a new ideal of elegance and accuracy in literary scholarship and a fascination with human behaviour. Of all the northern humanists, none is more famous than Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus is remembered as a many-faceted humanist, author of translations, dialogues, diatribes, theological tracts, writing manuals, study guides, proverb collections, amusing diversions, and astonishing quantities of letters. He developed a circle of correspondents and friends to rival Petrarch's. By comparison with Petrarch, he had the benefit of almost 200 years' worth of extra scholarship to draw on, as well as an ever more well-connected continent to explore. He was no questioner of Christian faith, being very devout, but he did add his own deep belief in the importance of living wisely and well in this world. He believed completely in the benefits of education and in the ways in which literature and study could help people flourish. None of that long list of cultural contributions would have seemed especially likely when he was born, in Rotterdam, probably in 1466. He was illegitimate. His parents, though living in domestic contentment, could not marry because his father was a priest. They took care to give Erasmus and his older brother the best schooling they could. This meant a series of monastic institutions, culminating in the one in Deventer. The Deventer monks were highly respected, and the community had long been known for its excellent manuscript copying. But Erasmus came to view this, and his previous schools, with loathing. One reason was the air of violence. In that era it was considered normal and even essential to beat pupils, but Erasmus had been traumatised at his earlier school by being hit merely as a test of how good he was at bearing it. The effect on Erasmus was to implant in him a lifelong aversion to cruelty or intimidation of any kind. Another reason Erasmus took a poor view of his schooling lay in the unworldliness of the monks' attitudes. For Erasmus, a young mind needs to be liberated from meaningless, useless systems of knowledge as taught by unenlightened masters who themselves have no idea how to live. Erasmus came to this view slowly. At first he did follow the expected path, and took orders himself in another monastery. He even wrote a treatise in praise of monastic existence. But he wrote another around the same time, which attacked the ill-educated monks and their tendency to ignore the humanistic subjects of moral philosophy, history, and good Latin. Erasmus seems to have been trying his hand at different arguments and showing his literary versatility. It was his writing skill that earned him his escape, when the Bishop of Cambrai took him on as a secretary. The bishop also arranged for him to go to Paris and study at the University of the Sorbonne. That was unsatisfactory too. The Sorbonne was another bastion of medieval scholasticism. So Erasmus left Paris and adopted the pattern of life that he would continue to follow for the rest of his days, that of a travelling humanist. He would earn his way as a scholar, a writer, a publisher's assistant, a teacher, and a sort of general humanist consultant in institutions all over Europe. It was not easy, but intellectually, for the most part, it was a life of freedom. One of his first posts abroad was in England, where he helped to develop educational programmes. On the basis of this experience, Erasmus produced a series of treatises on the subject of training the young in humanistic life and techniques of study. He thought it was vital for students to acquire good manners, which is to say, ways of expressing fellow feeling and consideration for others. His 1530 work, On Good Manners for Boys, summed up the do's and don'ts of civilised behaviour. Don't wipe your nose on your sleeve, but blow it with a handkerchief, not too loudly, because trumpeting is for elephants. To deal with intestinal gas, be considerate and step away from others, or cover the sound with a cough. While doing all this, maintain an easy, relaxed look. The aim is to make life nicer for others. It is a method for not separating oneself from the world, like those awkward Sorbonne teachers or bad-tempered monks. Of course, there is more to education and humanitas than looking relaxed and farting quietly. Erasmus also taught the habits needed for a fulfilling intellectual life. And here, the key thing is to have a richly stocked mind. He recommends reading good books and keeping notes grouped by subject, so you can remember what you read and combine it with other ideas in useful ways. The important thing is to build up a treasure house, the literal meaning of thesaurus, in your mind, so it is always there as a resource. Travelling, reading, and friendship. Those were the three great themes of his life, and each of them fed the others. He followed where these opportunities led. As he once said, "My home is wherever I keep my library." One of Erasmus's longest sojourns was in the Swiss city of Basel. This was a great city for humanists, having an excellent university and many publishers. The city's leading humanist printer was Johannes Froben, himself very scholarly and host of a bookish community. Erasmus moved into Froben's house and wrote excitedly to a friend, "They all know Latin. They all know Greek. Most of them know Hebrew too. One is an expert historian, another an experienced theologian, one is skilled in the mathematics, one a keen antiquary, another a jurist. I certainly have before never had the luck to live in such a gifted company. And to say nothing of that, how open-hearted they are, how gay, how well they get on together." Erasmus started work on an important project for Froben, producing a new Latin translation of the New Testament, breaking away from the standard 4th century one by Jerome. Erasmus went back to the Greek Testament to create his new dual-language Greek and Latin edition. It came out in 1516. The following year, Martin Luther posted his 95 anti-clerical theses in Wittenberg and broke with Rome. The Pope excommunicated him, and Western Europe was set on its long path of religious conflict. In the early stages, Erasmus showed a certain sympathy for Luther's position, feeling that the Church ought to have dealt more wisely and sensitively with such challenges to its authority. On the other hand, he also became repelled by the aggression of Luther, who was a born contrarian and fighter. Erasmus thought that it would make more sense to mitigate through courteous treatment an issue sharp by its very nature than to add ill will to ill will. Courtesy, of course, was everything to him, more than just a social veneer. It was the very basis for all mutual respect and concord. Feeling uncomfortable in an increasingly pro-reformist Basel, Erasmus moved again to Freiburg im Breisgau, another university town, but one that remained calmly Catholic. He made no secret of the fact that he preferred tranquillity. "When popes and emperors make the right decisions, I follow, which is godly. If they decide wrongly, I tolerate them, which is safe." Erasmus did have courage, but it was of a different sort. He preferred to advance arguments for peace quietly and persistently. What he hated above all was war. Already, before the Reformation, he had used his text In Praise of Folly to describe war as a monster, a wild beast, and a plague. He explained war as a result of bad government. It is a blunder, a failure, and a falling off from the level of the truly human. By nature, we have all the skills we need for cooperation. We're drawn to friendship and collaborative life. This is our true nature, yet somehow we forget this. And we always need to develop and refine the skills we need to avoid disasters and to better manage our relationships, society, and politics. This learning is acquired from each other, and as we learn it, so should we also pass it on to further generations. This is a key reason why education, especially in the arts of civics and civility is so central to the humanist view of the world. Later commentators observed, with sadness, that Erasmus seemed to underestimate the real depth of human attraction to violence, unreason, and fanaticism, probably because of his own cordial personality. Immune to the thrill of battle and the intoxication of radical ideas himself, he simply could not understand why others found them so powerful. Like many generally peaceful people, meanwhile, Erasmus could be stubborn, and his friends commemorated this aspect of him after his death in 1536. They created a memorial plaque for him, featuring the motto of Terminus, Roman god of boundaries and limits. The motto was one Erasmus had adopted as his own: I yield to no one. His real memorial and afterlife are found in the legacy of his ideas on education, on religion, and on the movement for peace and international cooperation. One of the most admirable examples of the latter is found in a programme inaugurated in 1987 and administered by the European Union. It enables students to travel and study in each other's countries and to have their resulting qualifications recognised as equally valid everywhere in the Union. So far, over 10 million people have participated, gaining immensely from the opportunity to live in different countries, learn languages, and make friends and professional contacts that can last a lifetime. Officially, the name of this programme is the European Region Action Scheme for the Mobility of University Students, now with an added plus. What a lucky coincidence that this just happens to spell out Erasmus. It thus honours the legacy of Europe's great pioneer of peace, mutual understanding, educational innovation, the sharing of knowledge and experience, free movement, and especially friendship among many.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Humanly Possible by Sarah Bakewell, read by Emma Fielding. Episode 3. In the 16th century, the educationalist and author Desiderius Erasmus had said that man certainly is not born, but made man. He cited an old legend taken from Pliny, that baby bears were born as formless lumps and then licked into a proper bear shape by their mothers. Perhaps humans needed to be formed into a human shape too, at least mentally, if not physically. It was a nice thought for teachers to contemplate, since it made them sound very important. One could even see teachers as guiding the whole future development of humanity. If each generation had a better education than the one before, and then produced new teachers in their turn, the result was that great Enlightenment goal: progress. This prospect, and the casting of education as a great source of humanist hope, really took off in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in German-speaking lands. The approach can be summed up in 2 German words. One is Bildung, which means education. The other is Humanismus, which came to denote the whole area of history, language, the arts and moral thinking, as well as education. German historians also applied the term retrospectively to an earlier era. Excited by figures such as Leonardo da Vinci, the multidimensional, versatile, universal man of his time, now the educators of the North wondered if they could produce such figures by means of a new education system. It should be an education aimed at many-sidedness or complete human harmony, rather than on the narrow business of inculcating skills. The first person to have a chance actually to put this into practice on a large scale was Wilhelm von Humboldt, the man to whom the Prussian government entrusted the job in 1809 of redesigning their entire educational system for a new era. Prussian education would acquire a reputation for being strict and regimented, yet the man who invented it was startlingly unconventional in many ways, driven by a great personal love of freedom and of humanistic culture. Humboldt's own early unfolding took place in a situation of high privilege. He was born in 1767 into the family that owned a 16th century mansion beautifully set near a lake on the edge of Berlin. There he had his education from private tutors, as did his brother Alexander. Despite being 2 years behind him in age, and also despite doing very little work at his books, Alexander tended to attract more attention. While Wilhelm was a quieter inward type, Alexander was mercurial and outgoing. Alexander went on to become a renowned explorer and scientist. He would have literally hundreds of things named after him, from mountains to plants to penguins. Wilhelm had his own charm, and although he had some interest in the sciences and natural history, what really excited him were the humanities, especially languages, the arts, and politics. In those fields, and in his inward way, he became just as adventurous and just as much of a maverick as Alexander, determined to live by his own lights. He was studious, but not solemn. His daughter later described him as being habitually merry and witty, as well as showing perfect goodness and kindness. Things would be named after him too. It's just that they were schools and universities, rather than penguins. In 1789, 2 things happened in Wilhelm's life. While he and his tutor were travelling in France, the French Revolution broke out. They rushed to Paris so Wilhelm could have the educational experience of witnessing it. What he saw did not convert him to revolutionary politics, but he was struck by the general atmosphere of freedom in the air, as well as by the extreme poverty still so evident in the city. This led Wilhelm to write, "How few people study human misery in all its horrible extent, and yet what study is more necessary?" The feeling that it was essential to study human life and experience remained with him. The other event of 1789 had its origin in his own reasonings rather than in outward events. He laid out these thoughts in a tract written while he was still a student. It discussed the contentious issue of whether the state was entitled to tell people what to believe. 2 years later, he incorporated his conclusions into a longer political work. It came out in English in 2 versions called The Sphere and Duties of Government and The Limits of State Action. It doesn't matter what you do with it. The title was less than thrilling. The contents, however, were bold. Government authorities, he wrote, seem to feel it their duty to impose some particular religion or dogma on their society because they think that otherwise everything will turn into immorality and chaos. Humboldt disagreed, and for humanistic reasons. He had a humanist's view of morality. He thought that its seeds lie in our own natural predisposition towards kindness and fellow feeling. Such impulses need guidance and development, but they do not need replacing by state-imposed commandments. For Humboldt, principles such as love or justice harmonise sweetly and naturally with our very humanity, but for this harmony to have any effect, there must be a free field of operation. Thus, in effect, a state that enforces a particular belief is denying people the right to be fully human. So Humboldt advises the state to limit itself, at least where matters of individual humanity and morality are concerned. People should be able to explore these things in their own way, with one proviso, however. If their actions lead them to encroach on the development or well-being of others, say through violent or destructive behaviour, then the state should intervene to stop them. Humboldt thus asserts the key principle of political liberalism. The government is not there to tell people whom to marry, or what to believe or say, or how to worship, but mainly to make sure their choices do not harm others. And similar principles apply for Humboldt in matters of education. Human character develops best when it is, he wrote, unfolded from the inner life of the soul, rather than imposed on it. For that to happen, we need good humanistic teachers, but we do not need or want intrusive rules by the state. This is not a philosophy likely to appeal to any traditionalist regime. It may seem strange that the man who wrote this book would be entrusted by the authorities with designing a major national education programme. But almost no one knew that he had written it, because the book did what humanistic works frequently do. It went into the author's desk and stayed there for decades. In the meantime, he became an eminent establishment figure. He moved around Europe, taking up governmental and diplomatic postings. This solid career was what made him a good choice when the Prussian education project came up in 1809. Humboldt applied himself to it systematically, but he also seems to have seen an opportunity at last to put some of his liberal ideas into practice. So education at all levels was not to be primarily about acquiring skill sets, but about creating human beings with moral responsibility, a rich inner life, and intellectual openness to knowledge. Besides applying his belief in freedom to education, government, and religious belief, Humboldt also applied it in his personal life. He was married to Carolina von Dachererden, or Lee, as he always called her. They had children and seemed to have been happy together. In his secret tract on the role of the state, Humboldt had already suggested that freedom should also mean trusting people to work out their own choices in marriage and sexuality. Again, so long as no harm was done, and so long as the situation was consensual. Otherwise, each marriage should mostly be allowed to follow its own course, just as each human individual should. Thus, Carolina took other lovers, and Wilhelm pursued his fantasy life. His sexuality was unorthodox. We know about this only because he wrote about it in his journal, where he recorded his daydreams. What fascinated him was the idea of struggling to subdue physically strong working-class women. And what makes this so interesting is that, in writing about it, he also reflected on both its origins and its effects in his own psychology. Long before Sigmund Freud had made such an idea seem obvious, Humboldt wondered in his journal whether such desires might shed light on other aspects of human nature. He speculated that leading a life of such vivid sexual imagination had fed his interest in human relationships and in the study of all character, the central pursuit of his intellectual career. The unusual aspects of his relationship with Carolina had another fortunate consequence. We have a voluminous correspondence between them, which we would not have had if one of them had always been in the drawing room and the other in the study. His letters to her are filled with his reflections on humanity, on education, and on his other research interests. He wrote in one of his letters to Carolina, "The more in life one searches for and finds human beings, the richer, more self-sufficient, more independent one becomes oneself, more humanised, more readily touched by all that is human in all the facets of one's nature and in all aspects of creation. This is the goal, dear Lee, to which my nature urges me. The Humboldtian model of education would have a widespread influence, and in large parts of German-speaking territory it remained dominant well into the 20th century, until 1933, that is, when the Nazis came to power and threw out its humanistic ideals entirely. They replaced Humboldt's model with a giant indoctrination machine designed to turn boys into warriors and girls into mothers for producing more warriors. The forming of well-rounded, fully human, free, cultured individuals had no place in the fascists' world. They had no wish to humanise anyone. Quite the opposite. Along with the afterlife of his educational ideas, Humboldt's youthful political ideas about freedom would have an afterlife too. When he died, his heirs began going through the papers in his study, and they found the tract on the limits of the state. It finally saw publication, thanks to his brother Alexander. In 1852, the limits came out.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Humanly Possible by Sarah Bakewell, read by Emma Fielding. Episode 4. Some of the new discoveries reaching the public in the 19th century carried such major implications for how we think about humanity that religious authorities had a hard time keeping up. First, the geologists came for them, brandishing evidence that the Earth was both older than the Bible implied and in a state of constant movement and transition that did not fit with the creation story. Then the paleontologists came for them, with their fossils of vanished or altered species. Even the speleologists came for them, finding remains of an extinct hominid type in Neander Valley caves in Germany. Then it was the turn of Charles Darwin, with his 1859 book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. His theory of the variety of life was elegant. As members of a species reproduce themselves over an immense period of time, random variations occur, generating a bigger beak, a longer toe, or some new fluffy ear hair. These can be passed on to offspring. If the variation works well in their environment, those individuals thrive and go on to produce more such offspring. If it does not work, they often die without issue. This is how, as he concluded the book, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. It is a vision of majesty, but also of horror, since Darwin admits that it all depends on cycles of failure and suffering. He writes, "Thus from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely, the production of the higher animals, directly follows." Not only does this tell us that life comes from death, but also that we might be those higher animals, and thus results of such a process too. At this stage, he says nothing more overt about us than that. He would not do so until 1871, with The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. Still, even at the first appearance of On the Origin of Species, the implications for humanity were not hard to see. Another writer saw immediately that Darwin's book was going to originate a fight. His name was Thomas Henry Huxley. As a zoologist and educator and an eloquent essayist and polemicist, he would do more than anyone else in that period to promote Darwinism, and, in the process, to bring together two great 19th century currents, the boom in education and free thinking, and the turn towards science-based ways of thinking about ourselves. He thus inaugurated a new type, the scientific humanist. Huxley's friendship with Darwin had started a little earlier, when Darwin invited him to Down House, his home in Kent, to see his collection of sea squirts. Huxley loved sea squirts. A naturalist who had originally trained as a physician, he had just returned to Britain after a 4-year voyage around the Pacific in the official post of ship's doctor. Having devoted his time on the voyage to collecting marine and other species, he had now been taken on to produce the British Museum's catalogue of its sea squirt specimens. So he eagerly accepted Darwin's invitation and enjoyed his tour of the house's grounds, with their plantings and greenhouses, their exotic pigeon breeds, and their many experiments and collections in constant expansion. Darwin seemed to be a harmless, diligent enthusiast. Huxley, like almost everyone else, had no idea that he was using all this as material for a dramatic new theory of life. When On the Origin of Species was unveiled, and Huxley realised what Darwin had been up to all that time, he was keen to help. Unlike the gentlemanly Darwin, Huxley was of more socially modest origins, and everything in his career had been a fight for him. First, he reviewed the book. Then he gave lectures, making use of newsworthy props. At the Royal Institution, to show the effects of selection processes in breeding, he memorably released a range of live pigeons from a basket before the audience's eyes, like a magician in a stage show. Huxley himself became ever more famous, thanks to such performances. He went on to write successful popularisations of Darwinian theory, notably his Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature of 1863, with a frontispiece showing a series of skeletons of apes marching along in formation and culminating in a human figure. Less well remembered now is his role as an all-round public intellectual and a communicator of humanistic as well as scientific ideas. He took a great interest in education. Like Matthew Arnold, he was adamant that all social classes should have access to good quality material. Like Wilhelm von Humboldt, he believed that learning should continue throughout life. In accordance with these ideas, he helped found the South London Working Men's College in 1868. And it would be to workers' educational institutions like this, not to elite or professional audiences, that he delivered some of his most important lectures. He agreed with Arnold and Humboldt that the purpose of education was to produce well-rounded human beings with a rich mental life. Yet he did not agree with their idea that the humanities were the best place to start. Instead, he suggested that a better foundation might lie in studying the sciences. These taught children the basics of the physical world and also gave them humanistic skills in the form of an inquiring attitude. It taught them to observe phenomena closely and to learn actively through experiments, as opposed to taking everything from the authority of ancient texts or even of teachers. After an 1880 talk by Huxley, giving his arguments for starting education with a scientific foundation, Matthew Arnold came back with the essay Literature and Science. Science was indeed important, he said, but the humanities were even more so, not least because they held the key to making human sense out of science's discoveries. He wrote that a good education founded on ethics and the humanities helps us to deal more subtly with the human and ethical world. It also provides us with high standards to live up to. In fact, they were both making a valuable contribution to a fuller picture of humanism here. The Arnold and Huxley debate, playing out between two cultured and eloquent writers, each imbued with the spirit of their time, captures a moment when the atmosphere was changing in humanistic thought. From now on, both humanities-based humanism and the more forward-looking progressivist humanism of the Enlightenment would find themselves in the company of the new arrival, scientific humanism. The principles of the latter An interest in modern scientific methods and reasoning, along with a naturalistic interpretation of how humans fit into the picture, would remain a part of the larger humanist worldview into our own time. Humanities-based, ethical forms of humanism remind us that we are spirited, cultured, and moral beings. We are formed by our human environment as well as by our physical nature. Scientific humanism reminds us that we are animals too, and that we live in a constant process of transition on a changing Earth in a very large universe. If everything is in a good balance, these visions of ourselves do not work at cross purposes, they inform and enhance each other. In the closing passage of On the Origin of Species, Darwin had marvelled at the way simple natural processes could produce extraordinary and beautiful results. But he also realised that his theory of natural selection and survival did not provide an obvious basis for human morality. It provided no direct basis, that is, but in The Descent of Man, he did come up with a possible indirect explanation of how morality entered our human world. His theory owed a lot to humanists of the Enlightenment era, such as David Hume, because he thought, as they did, that morality probably emerged from our tendencies to fellow feeling and sympathy. Like all social species, early humans had to negotiate the interpersonal challenges of the group. This has made us sensitive to others' responses. When they treat us positively, we feel good. Other animals share such sensitivity, but in our case, we also have language. So we can go further in expressing feelings in terms of praise or blame. Our moral world deepens because we can also look back on past situations to make comparisons between the things we've done before and the responses they evoked. Out of this, general ethical opinions begin to form, and these are shared with others. Thus, emerging from a combination of habit, example, instruction, and reflection, a moral system comes into being. Darwin took humanistic morality as a guide in his own life too. He had lost his Christian belief as a young man, not least because he could not bear the thought of there being a hell, that most unempathetic of ideas, since it involves accepting the suffering of others. Writing private notes, he reflected that he had always felt his deepest satisfactions when he had helped others, and then when they had thought well of him because of it, especially if they were people to whom he was close. For him, these feelings amply compensated for the lost idea of God. He did not go so far as to call himself an atheist, even in private notes, but he did call himself an agnostic. The person who did the most to popularise this term was, again, T.H. Huxley. He wrote an essay headed simply Agnosticism in 1889, and there explained that he had arrived at this label after going through other possible ways of describing himself. Was he perhaps, he asked, an atheist, a theist, or a pantheist, a materialist or an idealist, a Christian or a freethinker? None of these felt right, although the last one was not bad. The rest all seemed to name some definite belief in how the world was, but he had no such belief. He settled on agnostic, because it was the opposite of a Gnostic, that is, someone who claims gnosis or knowledge. Such ways of talking about religion captured a growing sense that the presence of God was withdrawing from the human mental landscape. In his poem Dover Beach, Matthew Arnold looks out of a window onto a beach at night. He hears the pebbles rolling as the tide goes out, and imagines it as a sea of faith, receding and leaving a conflict-ridden world lacking sense or meaning. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. If there is some faint hope, he concludes, it can be found only in our fidelity to one another, or, as we might say, our empathy and attachment to one another as living beings.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
Humanly Possible by Sarah Bakewell, read by Emma Fielding, Episode 5. If you wanted a manifesto for what the poet John Milton had called chaos and old night, as recreated in the 20th century, you could start with the two-part summary of Italian fascist ideology, published in 1932, co-written by Benito Mussolini and his philosophical sidekick, Giovanni Gentile. Gentile, who was the author of the main theoretical parts, explained that a fascist state does not aim at increasing human happiness or well-being, and it is not interested in the idea of progress. If life were always gradually improving, why would anyone be motivated to fight or die for a transcendent, glorious purpose? Peace is not desirable either. There is nothing good about making compromises and seeking equilibrium with other nations, as Erasmus or Bertrand Russell would have wished. The same goes for individual development or freedom, the goals sought by humanistic political theorists such as John Stuart Mill or Wilhelm von Humboldt. Far from the liberal vision of the state as staying out of people's lives except to stop them hurting one another, the fascist state wades in, and it does sometimes want to hurt people, to advance national interests. Originating in 1919, Italy's National Fascist Party appealed initially to a cohort of disoriented young men who had fought in the First World War and then returned to find themselves ignored and abandoned to their poverty. The party restored their sense of belonging and meaning. In 1922, Mussolini became Prime Minister. He hoped to acquire a better intellectual gloss by appointing the philosophy professor Gentile his Minister of Education, as well as unofficial theorist. Education was important because, in the fascist vision, ordinary human beings as we know them need to be transformed to fit the state's needs. As Gentile wrote, fascism offered a complete transfiguration of the human. It sought to rebuild the man, the character, the faith. Gentile organised the opening of new elementary schools all over the country, in some ways a good thing, as it raised basic education levels. But the syllabus was highly ideological, impressing on young minds the grandeur of imperial Rome and a general sense of Italy's unique destiny. A similar educational programme was launched in Germany after Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. Its main purpose, according to Erika Mann's study of Nazi education, was to produce children incapable of imagining anything much beyond nation and race. Faced with the rise of fascism in the 1930s, the German novelist Thomas Mann, father of Erika, emigrated to America along with his family. He had been aware of the magnetism of extreme ideas for some time and had explored them extensively in his fiction, not least in the 1929 short story Mario and the Magician, which depicts a sinister stage conjurer, Cipolla, exerting an uncanny power over the crowds who come to see him, just as Mussolini and Hitler did. Now he was horrified, not only by the failure of humanism to assert itself against this power, but by the way that so many people actually seemed to long for a world of violence and unreason. But a sense that humanists were insufficiently bold came into it too. In a lecture of April 1935, Mann said, "In all humanism, there is an element of weakness, which may be its ruin." He blamed its tendency to be too flexible. Humanists give in too easily, and they always try to see the other side of any question. When dealing with murderous fanaticism, that is not necessarily helpful. As war loomed through the 1930s, libraries and cultural heritage sites around Europe worked hard to shore up their collections against destruction. Buildings were protected with sandbags. Art was stored in hideaways away from main population centres. In Florence, masterpieces from the Uffizi galleries were moved to country locations. When war began, with all its chaos, death and loss, these secret stashes of human culture and beauty waited in their havens for it to end. The few people lucky enough to have found havens also waited and worked. From his California home, Thomas Mann began to broadcast monthly messages in German via the BBC. Sometimes in these recordings he spoke of specific news, reporting on atrocities that German listeners were presumed not to know about, as when, early in 1942, news came through of a number of Jewish people in Holland being rounded up and gassed to death. More often, he concentrated on reminding his listeners, over and over, that the Reich did not represent Germany, still less humanity in general, and therefore that it could not last. The war did end eventually, and the Nazi killing machine ended with it. What was left was the counting of losses, human and cultural. Out of this process of reckoning and readjustment came plans for new international structures and institutions designed, it was hoped, to make such wars less likely to recur. The largest was the United Nations. Among its offshoots was UNESCO, the United Nations educational, scientific and cultural organisation. Its Erasmian founding text stated that as wars begin in human minds, peace must start there too. It set about enabling the latter goal with an ambitious policy of funding and encouraging libraries, museums, zoos, botanical gardens, scientific research institutes, universities and the like. Its conception was strongly humanistic. Its first Director General wrote, "The key concept behind all our activities should be fulfilment. Fuller realisation of capacities by individuals, cities, nations, and humanity as a whole." This remained at the heart of everything UNESCO did. Unfortunately, the effect could not be as whole as hoped, because the Soviet Union and its satellites stayed aloof. The Soviet bloc also proved awkward collaborators when another UN project was launched a couple of years later: the writing of a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, discussed throughout 1947 and completed the following year. The drafting committee, headed by Eleanor Roosevelt, worked hard to produce a document that was as inclusive and culturally sensitive as possible, with remarkable success by the standards of its time. What emerged was a text beginning with the resounding words, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood." The Declaration is a deeply humanistic statement. It is also a practical one, designed to be used as a legal support in cases of human rights abuses. Almost every nation approved it, but the list of abstentions speaks volumes. They came from 6 communist countries, plus South Africa, because the declaration could not be reconciled with apartheid, and Saudi Arabia, because it disliked a clause providing for equal rights for men and women in marriage. It may seem easy to take the principles expressed in the Declaration for granted, until they are trampled upon. Then, like humanistic values in general, they suddenly look more worth the effort of protecting. While these discussions were going on in global meeting rooms, art historians, monuments men, and other volunteers and experts were tackling the task of cultural revival in a more field-based way. They toured Europe, finding, securing and protecting the buildings and artworks that had made it through the war reasonably intact. Among them was Frederick Hart. Often he followed in the steps of the fearless and energetic Cesare Fazola, a member of the Uffizi staff and himself a partisan of the resistance. He and Hart were among the first to arrive at the castle of Montegiufone, a storage site for many items from the Uffizi. They found an unnerving scene. The German troops billeted there had now gone, but they had left Botticelli's Primavera casually leaning against a wall and turned Domenico Ghirlandaio's circular Adoration of the Magi into a drinks table. But the most obvious aspect in which humans needed to pull themselves together in the aftermath of the Second World War concerned nuclear weapons. As Jean-Paul Sartre put it in October 1945, the lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was that, from now on, it would always be up to human beings to decide whether they wanted to survive or not. The ultimate existentialist decision. Another public humanist who phrased the problem in a memorable way was Bertrand Russell. He concluded a 1954 radio broadcast, Man's Peril, with a call to make a choice. There lies before us, if we choose, continual progress in happiness, knowledge and wisdom. Shall we instead choose death because we cannot forget our quarrels? I appeal, as a human being, to human beings. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. The rest, being national interests, vanity, pride, prejudice, despair, and anything else that gets in the way of choosing to live, became a much-quoted line, not least by Russell himself. Russell's campaigns, by their nature, were often against things: nuclear weapons, the depredation of nature, and wars. His general attitude towards the world, however, was anything but negative. A few months before his death, in February 1970, he closed his autobiography with a summation of his experience of almost a century of life. I may have thought the road to a world of free and happy human beings shorter than it is proving to be, but I was not wrong in thinking that such a world is possible, and that it is worthwhile to live with a view to bringing it nearer. I have lived in the pursuit of a vision, both personal and social. Personal, to care for what is noble, for what is beautiful, for what is gentle, to allow moments of insight to give wisdom at more mundane times. Social, to see in imagination the society that is to be created, where individuals grow freely and where hate and greed and envy die, because there is nothing to nourish them. These things I believe, and the world, for all its horrors, has left me unshaken.